Good afternoon, Dr. Talleyrand. Welcome, welcome. Thank you for joining us today in Cannabis Talk with Mike Lawson Jr. You're an esteemed guest. I had the pleasure of meeting you at the Emerald Conference, and thank you so much for your time.
Oh, thanks for having me. Happy to be here.
Absolutely, absolutely. Well, let's get right into it, man. Can you do us a favor and just introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about your background and what led you on this journey into medical cannabis?
Wow. Okay. So, yes, I am a third generation physician.
Wow.
So my grandfather's a physician. My father's a physician. And I guess I fell into it uh, after some influence from them.
Right.
Uh, Went to a school in New England, in Providence, Rhode Island, and then again in Boston, which is where I did medical school. So pretty traditional upbringing in the East Coast, and then came out to the West Coast, and where I was doing my residency. I did my residency in family and community medicine.
Mm,
And part of the goal or the underlying idea in family and community medicine is to get involved with your community,
right.
old school, doctor of a community. Well, my community in San Francisco, California, was definitely using cannabis. Right a year before I started my residency, the California voters had passed Prop 215, the
Absolutely.
Compassionate Use Act,
Yes.
basically allowing the community to grow and possess their own cannabis. So that, as you know, started this whole movement. And I was there early on. Mostly as an observer, because that's really, all we knew. There was not any teaching in medical school about cannabinoids or the endocannabinoid system. It
Mm,
was relatively new. The endocannabinoid system was really identified in the late 80s, early 90s. Um, so medical schools to this day, unfortunately, are not uh, uh, are not do not have endocannabinoid system education.
and why do you
Uh,
think that is?
wow. I mean, maybe the medical world is slow to develop. Uh, we're still understanding what it means, what the endocannabinoid system means.
Right.
What it started out as is it started out with the discovery that we have chemicals in our body that attach to the same receptor that THC attaches to.
Right.
And so the receptors were called CB1 and CB2. Uh, so they're deemed cannabinoid receptors. And then we had intrinsic, just like endorphins. Endorphins are chemicals in our body that attach to opiate receptors.
Right.
So endocannabinoids are chemicals in our body that attach to cannabinoid receptors.
Got it.
Uh, so we're just learning about it, and there's a lot of information being developed, and I think that maybe medical schools are dragging their feet because of the stigma of THC. Although this is unfortunate, because it really has not much to do with THC, although THC very much influences the endocannabinoid system.
Right.
This is a system that we all have, that all animals have, that is pretty much your nervous system. It influences your nervous system as well as your immune system. So it's neuroinflammatory system, but it's a very interesting one in which we might find a lot of potential therapeutic benefits from. And maybe that's also it. We're still working on finding the therapeutic benefits from manipulating or mitigating the endocannabinoid system.
Wow, wow. So really you're one of the pioneers in medical cannabis, being that you started your residency in San Francisco right around the time when Prop 215 passed. I was 13 years old at the time, living in Los Angeles. So I also I consider myself a child of the culture. And I was very aware of what was happening. And many of my friends whose parents were dealing with different medical conditions were using cannabis, openly, and it was it was a discussion that was had very often, I think, in our side of the country. So tell me, how was that when you made your decision? Um, was that something you talked to your grandfather and your father about? Like, you know what, I'm going to get into medical cannabis. I'm working in the community. This is what the community wants. This is what they're doing. How did your grandfather and your father react to that?
I would have loved to have talked to my grandfather, but he'd passed by then.
Oh, okay,
I
okay.
would have died to know what he would have said about it. My father is very much a scientist.
Mm,
Yeah, he's a pure scientist. He's a great example of someone who looks at the facts objectively, and really his specialty was pathology. So
mm,
he was made one of the more basic scientists of the field. They're the ones who do the autopsies and look to see what the cause of death was, and
right.
they're the ones who oversee the labs, and so very much data driven physician. And to him, it's well, where's the data? And
Mhm.
okay, let's go. So
Right.
not a lot of influence on social stigma from him. So I think I've taken up a bit of that. I'm more like my grandfather in that I got involved in primary care. I'm
Mm,
more intertwined into the community and all the social aspects of of cannabis or of medicine in general.
right.
And that's what was interesting to me.
Right.
As I got interested in complementary and alternative treatments, going out into the community to see what they were using. If you prescribe someone high blood pressure medicine, let's say, but
Mhm.
in their community, they're used to using different medicines, like
Sure.
traditional Chinese medicine. They
Mhm.
may take your blood pressure medicine and then go and pick up an herbal medicine from a traditional Chinese doctor and then use both, or they may ignore your medicine and use what they're more comfortable with. So it's an interesting field to me because you really have to pay attention to things outside of your comfort zone. You're,
Right.
knowing what it's not just enough to know what the right blood pressure medicine is. You really have
Right.
to understand the context of where the patient lives. What environment, what community influences, what social influences. Well, in San Francisco, there were people who with chronic pain
Mm.
who had chosen cannabis. In fact, what convinced me was when a patient came up and handed over his opiate pills.
Wow.
And most of the time, people were asking for more opiate pills, not saying I don't need these anymore. Uh,
Right.
and he explained to me that cannabis was helping him manage his pain, and that he didn't need
Wow.
the opiates anymore. And I knew that cannabis was safer than a lot of the opiate medications, so that was a positive in terms of safety. And so it was good news all the way around. So I said, "What is this plant that's helping people with pain?" And come to
Right.
find out, it not only helps with pain, it helps improve moods. It helps
Absolutely.
people who are anxious or depressed. It helps improve disordered sleep. People who can't sleep very well,
Absolutely.
and it also helps improve issues with appetite. IBS,
Mm.
nausea.
Mm.
Uh, so even conditions like Crohn's or ulcerative colitis, inflammatory bowel conditions. So really, most of the patients that I'm seeing fell into those categories, and became a great medicine for them.
Absolutely. When you started working in this space, were there a set of conditions that you were primarily seeing, and have they grown over time? Has the list gotten longer, or has it been really the same focus, and like what you mentioned, chronic pain and all the conditions that you just mentioned?
It's been pretty much the same. I'd say 95% of the patients I'm seeing are that are for those reasons. There are more rare conditions, but mostly because they occur rarely.
Right.
Um, uh, conditions like seizure disorders,
Hmm.
or someone's trying to diagnose with cancer and trying to use cannabis as chemotherapy. Not, you know, THC is approved as a pharmaceutical for nausea during chemotherapy,
Hmm.
but a lot of the patients also are using cannabis to see if they can influence the size of the tumor to reduce the tumor. So they're really using it as chemotherapy as well.
Right.
Uh, uh, and there's some evidence that it works for certain cancers. Uh,
Yeah, that was my next question. Is there data to support using cannabis to reduce the size of tumors? I've been hearing that as well, but I'm not familiar with the data behind it.
Most of the research has been preclinical, meaning that they've done it on in petri dishes, on
Right.
cells,
Right.
or they've done it on animals. There are some studies on humans, and there are currently some ongoing studies in Europe. One is on liver cancer, and the other is on glioblastoma, which is a brain cancer. So yeah, there are some clinical studies now regarding cannabinoids and cancer.
Wow. So 1996, Prop 215 passes. It's 2022, right?
Hmm.
Where in you, I mean, you, like I said, you're a pioneer in this space. So where do you see the future of medical cannabis going, and where would you like it to go?
Well, I guess when I first started, I really thought, oh wow, we're going to discover this plant and all potential pharmaceuticals from it, and 20 years we should have it all wrapped up and know everything. And 20 years pass, and it feels like we've barely scratched the surface. Uh, uh, and yeah, where do I see us going? Well, really two paths as we've gone. There's really the path to discover the group of ingredients in the plant that are best affecting things like cancers and pain, seizures, and what have you. And that's exciting to me because the small molecule discoveries in pharmacology have been really single agent discoveries. And this plant is really telling us that we've got to branch out and look at multiple agents in one medicine and
Right.
see how that affects. So that's really broadening the field of pharmacology, which is completely interesting from a scientist's point of view.
Right.
As well, from a social point of view, people are beginning to feel more comfortable with cannabis use
Yes.
as opposed to alcohol.
Right.
Going to a bar to get a drink. Now people are discussing, well, going to a store and smoking. Well, smoking, of course, has its issues that we should be concerned with. And there are ways around it, meaning there are people who are looking into vaporizing, or people who are looking into edibles and producing cannabis for that. So there's a whole social aspect to it that's happening, and I see that road sort of splitting. There's going to be a social aspect to using cannabis, and then there's going to be a pharmaceuticals developed from what we learned about the plant.
Right. You, and just to circle back, when you talk about single agent and the cannabis plant, there's, where do you stand kind of in this whole plant paradigm versus people using these, isolated compounds, the CBD, CBDA, and all the other cannabinoids individually. Do you believe that there's more value in really focusing on the plant as a whole rather than, and looking at how these different compounds have this entourage effect and really understanding how they work in synchrony?
Well, I mean, the evidence is already out there. It's clear that that there's synergy between multiple ingredients in the plant, and
Right.
that these preparations tend to be better than the single agent. We've had the single agent in our repertoire
Right.
for quite a while.
Mhm.
THC, we can prescribe it as a single agent.
Mhm.
It's been available since the late 70s, early 80s.
Right.
And but you ask most people who are using cannabis, the plant, and you say, well, why don't you use the single agent THC? And they say it doesn't work as well as the plant. And
Right.
so there's clear feedback that the plant is more than just THC, more than just CBD. Right, the approval process for a multi-agent pharmaceutical is very difficult,
Mm.
and so most of the people who've uh, produced cannabinoids really are produced pharmaceuticals are really producing single agent pharmaceuticals because it's much easier to get that approved. So Epidiolex is the CBD only
Right.
medication. Marinol is a THC only medication. Those are around and doctors can prescribe those today.
Right.
But meanwhile, the community is experimenting with the plant because they're finding more efficacy with the plant. Also
Absolutely.
brings up safety issues, though.
Absolutely. And I'm super excited about how the data is starting to come in because I know when I started my master's in science in counseling 10 years ago, that there were all of these subjective claims about, cannabis and how it helps mitigate symptoms of post-traumatic stress and anxiety and all of the conditions that you already mentioned. But there wasn't much data to support it, particularly in the mental health world, right? And that's
Mhm.
when I really became passionate about it because I'm reading this literature and it's telling me the exact opposite of what my experience is
Mhm.
with the plant, right? It's just telling us this old Harry Anslinger, this is the demon plant, it should be prohibited and avoided at all costs. And so I really was scratching my head while I was working through that program, understanding like this goes completely against what millions of people are experiencing. And so fast forward, I met you at the Emerald Conference. It was my first time attending. I loved it. I was blown away, particularly by your presentation. But can you tell us a little bit about what the Emerald Conference is and how you got involved?
Wow. Well, so I partnered with Dr. John Abrams about 7 years ago, realizing that really we need to work on clinical studies in with cannabis.
Right.
And he fell in with a group of scientists that were developing the Emerald Conference. It was started by a company that sells equipment to the cannabis industry called Emerald Scientific,
Gotcha.
and they got these scientists together. It became the group of nerds in the industry,
Right.
and they've been going for 7 years, right? So this is the seventh conference. Pretty small, it didn't have the flash of the other conferences because really we stuck with scientists. We were sharing all of the findings that we were having in the field and really looking specifically at the plant rather than the single agents that were out there, trying to in some way deconvolute or discover what were the magic ingredients that were causing what. It's really a many to many problem because
Right.
there's a lot of different ingredients in these plants, hundreds and hundreds,
Right.
and there are a lot of potential conditions uh, that it can affect. And we've got to find the group of ingredients that fits best with a specific condition. So it's
Yes.
kind of like matching, hunting for a needle in a haystack in some ways. But
Yes.
it's, the more we understand how to search for it, the quicker we get to the solution. So this group of scientists were really interested in deconvoluting the multi-agent botanical cannabis and really understanding how we could, number one, produce consistent products, as well as find those magic formulas that help specific conditions. So that's why we fell in. That's how we fell into it. I guess we helped build it, and we found each other. The scientists found each other, and it's a good group of scientists now.
Oh yeah. I was I felt like I had found my tribe when I arrived, because I consider myself a cannabis nerd as well.
Well, we need more on mental health. I know that's what
Yes,
you do, and
yes,
if you can tell, that wasn't very prominent at the conference. So
that's
bring it
correct.
on. We actually definitely need to start doing more clinical studies in that realm.
Absolutely. I think the plant is still very stigmatized in
Mm,
the world of mental health. And I
mhm,
think I think it's just because it's misunderstood. I think there are a lot of professionals and clinicians in the mental health space where they are data driven as well. And
mhm,
I think a lot of it boils down to awareness,
mhm,
right? Because there's this huge stigma because this is belief that all of this is subjective, and people are just feeling what they're feeling, and it's not. And so I think when we expose the data to people in the mental health community, I think that will reduce the stigma over time. But it can be frustrating because, like as you mentioned, we don't have any issue with going to our local happy hour,
mhm.
right? But we have this huge stigma about cannabis and the smell and the nuisance of it and so on. But I always remind my colleagues, alcohol is one of those few substances that you can die from withdrawal,
Mhm,
right?
mhm.
Forget actually alcohol abuse, right, and overdosing on alcohol intake, but very few people, just citizens in the community, aren't even aware of the risk of alcohol withdrawal, and it's like,
Yeah, and also, alcohol, it sort of blends that line like cannabis does, with between recreational relaxation and self-medication, right?
right,
There are
yeah,
many people who consciously or unconsciously use alcohol to treat mental health issues, right?
absolutely.
Anxiety, depression, and that's how people fall into things like alcohol abuse, or
Yeah.
that there's some underlying issue. Well, cannabis falls into that category too. And where are the lines between self-medication or medication and recreation? I don't think it's so clear. To me, anyone who uses cannabis uses it for medical reason. But that's my screwed up perspective, being a doctor and looking at
I
people.
Man, I'm completely aligned with you on that. One of my slogans is cannabis is a medicine that we use recreationally, right? That
Interesting.
we've become comfortable using it recreationally, but I totally agree. And that brings me to our next topic. I'm actually, before we get into the dosing project, which I think is amazing, um, right after the Emerald Conference, I actually embarked, well, not right after, but a couple of weeks after, I started this 30-day cannabis cleanse, right?
Mm-hmm.
Where I'm abstaining from really all cannabinoids. I'm not using edibles or any kind of other routes of administration. Really, it was a personal journey, but also um, I got to a point where I realized my tolerance level was just a little too high, right?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Um, and just days into this cannabis cleanse, I really started to become clear that we need to understand our why in terms of why we're using the plant,
Mm-hmm.
right? Because, like you
Mm-hmm.
said, we're using it for a medical reason. We
Mm-hmm.
can, whether we're conscious of that or not,
Mm-hmm.
um, we're mitigating some type of issues that we have, whether it's
Mm-hmm.
anxiety, it's sleep. For me, it's symptoms of post traumatic stress,
Mm.
anxiety, like you said, sleep disruption. Um, but what I realize is, although we can't overdose, or we don't have any records of cannabis overdose, I do feel like you can overload your
Mm,
endocannabinoid system, right?
mhm.
And so that brings me to our next topic. Tell us about the dosing project and what it is and why it's important for us to understand.
Well, I mean, what by being a physician in the cannabis space or a cannabis specialist, I'm in observational mode. I'm asking people what they're using, how they're using it, and how it helps, and also if there are any adverse events or negative effects from it. And so this is basically my practice, learning from the patients, trying to impart the knowledge that I've gained from the cannabis research, so that they could use it better, they could use it in a safer way, they can have some education around it, and I can serve as a guide to them as they're going through the journey of using cannabis for whatever reason, recreation, medical. It's good to have somebody on your side. So that's what I do in my day-to-day practice. And in talking to my research partner, we figured we should start gathering data around that. And we thought the best way to do it was through a survey, an anonymous survey, because honestly, there's such stigma around it that what we saw is the data that I was collecting in the office was significantly different than the data we would get through the anonymous survey. And so,
Interesting.
and we felt that there was more truth in the anonymous survey. And so we set up this application where you use cannabis, you tell us what you're using, and you basically report back, how it worked and how safe it is. And from that, we can do some great analytical moves, statistical analysis, to start to understand dosage, to start to understand what the right dosage is, because
Right.
people right now are using trial and error methods to figure out the right dosage of the plant. And through all those efforts, we could probably get some very good information and then use that information to do our traditional clinical trials. It's much easier to do it that way than to start with coming up with a multi-agent pharmaceutical. There's so many potential ingredients we could put in a pill and try that out. Seemed daunting, but sort of looking at the problem backwards, screening the population for what they are using and learning from that to really make conclusions on dosage. And I think this is very important for governments, because governments are now regulating cannabis and they're putting dosage parameters on there, but nobody really knows what the right dosage is and what the
Right.
safest dosage is. And
Right.
so we're really screening the population to figure out really what's safe, what's not safe, and what works, what doesn't work, so that we can help the regulators come up with better rules around the use of it.
Absolutely. I'm a huge proponent of that. Like I said, I'm a true cannabis nerd. Um, I think the my journey into cannabis from an intellectual and academic perspective started my sophomore year of college,
Mm,
where I was going into the library one night and I had maybe like a quarter of a joint from earlier in the day that left over, and I smoked that. And when I tell you, I remember like it was yesterday. This was 20 years ago. I was laser focused in the
mm,
library. I was in there for about 5 hours, felt like 2 hours. And I was an English major. So I'm in there, doing research and writing. And little did I know back then, I was really microdosing
mhm,
cannabis. Right.
mhm.
And from that day on, I went and got a scale and I would weigh out my flour. Um, Really, my first, if I'm honest, my first inclination was just because I was on a budget, right? And I wanted, and I wanted to make sure, okay, if I have an eighth and I have 3.5 grams and I roll a joint this point 0.5, I know I have seven pre rolls, right? And so really, it started off with just trying to save money and resources. But then I realized, like, wait, if I started kind of playing around with the dosage, right, weighing half a gram, when, even a point 0.3, which is sounds really small, but at the end of the day, it's still effective. And
Mm,
20 years later, it's so funny you mentioned the stigma in the community. I never shared that with anybody. I
mhm.
didn't. I didn't share my methods, and wasn't really open to until recently. And then come to find out, as I'm moving in these communities, I'm realizing that not everybody is doing this. I mean, I've actually yet to meet somebody that's like, yeah, I weigh up all of my pre rolls as well. And so when I encountered your presentation, it was so spot on, because I think that so many scientists and clinicians that are driving this research, it's especially in terms of the flower, it's so subjective, right? We can smoke the same, or not even smoke, but consume through whatever route of administration the same amount of cannabis, and have in the same way, in the same time frame, in the same setting, and have a different result, right?
Mm,
Um, but I'm a huge proponent of. I encourage everyone, particularly who uses the flower, to get a scale. It's an
mm,
investment that can go a long way, um, and it's imperative in understanding our why, right? And so when your subjects were submitting their anonymous information, were they predominantly what was their route of administration? Were they smoking the plant? Was it edibles, ingestibles, tinctures, or what was it?
Well, we knew most people were smoking the flower,
Right.
so we only asked at first for responses from those who were smoking the flower. Right now, we are putting up a second version of the app, which will ask for responses from folks who are ingesting different products. Um, so yeah, we figured we'd look under the light, and also we figured if we could do this work with something as variable as the flower, and start to get some good data around that and see some conclusions around that, then the other routes of administration would be a lot easier, because the gummies are titrated to have a specific amount in them, or capsules or what have you. So we can, those will be easier than the flower. Flower, we really had to come up with categories, groups, and say, are you smoking 1 or 2 puffs, or 3 or 4 puffs, or are you smoking half a gram or a gram? And not every, like you say, not everybody was doing that. You definitely had your scientist hat on as you were pulling out your scale, and so they had to guess. But if you really think about it, you can kind of figure out what category you're in. Like you say, about half a gram or a third of a gram was doing it. Uh, you were achieving your goal with that amount. Some people just smoke as much as possible, but I really do believe at a certain point, you saturated. You're not getting anything different from smoking 2 grams versus 1 gram. Uh, uh, at some point, it's just, there's also the habit of putting something to your mouth and smoking that drives some people. But it was interesting to see from our dosing project results that really the most popular category, uh, where people were smoking the flower, was 3 to 4 puffs, uh,
Mm.
which is close to probably your quarter or a third of a gram.
Right. Right. Exactly. And I know me personally, I'll use maybe half a gram just for, and this is right before I started my tolerance break and my cannabis cleanse. So my tolerance was just super high.
Hmm.
But I was using maybe half a gram just for like mood regulation, reduce some anxiety. If I was going somewhere that was anxiety prone, I would use half a gram. But in the evenings, I would definitely roll a gram for sleep.
Hmm.
And I
Hmm.
know the effect that I'm going to get. And I agree. I feel like once you go beyond that, you know, I, I feel like we all hit a ceiling at some point,
Hmm.
right? And we have to be self aware enough to know, okay, you know, I'm not going to go any further than this.
Well,
Right.
kudos to you for saying, hey, it's time for a break. We definitely recommend that to our patients. The cost benefit
Yeah.
of taking a break so that you can get your tolerance back to a certain level. It's also important to do this with medication. I know
Yes.
many physicians don't discuss this, but drug holidays are discussed in the textbooks, in the medical
Mm,
textbooks, as
absolutely.
something that's important to do also. So cannabis is part of that. Good move.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm actually going to develop some curriculum around it because what I've discovered, I'm on day 21 today, actually,
Mhm,
and it's been fascinating. I noticed my energy levels went up, which was
mhm,
very interesting. I found myself
mhm,
having a lot of energy, um, but my appetite changed tremendously.
mhm,
It declined,
mhm,
and then I
mhm,
realized that wow, just my diet and where I eat, when I eat, had a lot to do with when I smoke cannabis. And you mentioned it, in terms of just the actual act of smoking and the ritual of it. I realized that we when you're a daily cannabis consumer, you really run the risk of being a prisoner to these rituals,
mhm.
to the point that there were places I didn't even want to eat because I wasn't smoking, right? Because I'm so used to Mr. Everything sandwiches. I'm used to, having a Coke before I go eat, or Fat Man's Rib Shack, and just going to those places, you know, uh, really just gave me this urge to want to use the plant. But after the first couple of days, and I think this is very subjective, but I think most daily, it seems like a consensus in the daily cannabis consumption community that it's the first 4 days that are the trickiest, right? But lucky for me, being that I come from the mental health space, I always tell people I kind of have the cheat code because I've studied this. Um,
Mhm,
and the reality is, what I've understood going into this, and clearly I got a real life lesson, is when you take something away, you have to replace it with something else,
mhm,
right?
mhm,
And one thing we haven't mentioned about a lot of cannabis consumption is a lot of people are using tobacco with their cannabis,
mhm,
right? And number one, I mean, subjectively, we know people like the vibe that they feel, and the high that they get. But I'm a big proponent that people are addicted to the nicotine,
mhm,
right? And so part of my process was abstaining from the tobacco weeks leading up to this process, right? Because I
mhm.
found it myself and friends of mine, and just having conversations in the community, that we're not, some of us are craving the THC and all the other compounds from the plant, but those of
Mhm.
us who use tobacco with the plant, we're really craving that nicotine. And
Yeah,
so,
as you probably already know, nicotine is considered one of the most addictive
absolutely.
substances out there. Absolutely. And what's also interesting is cannabis relieves anxiety and nicotine relieves anxiety. So that combination may be why people are putting them together. Cannabis tends to make one drowsy. Nicotine tends to be more of a stimulant. So
Right.
maybe there's balance to that too. That
Absolutely.
that they're why they're using it. So yeah, it's that's a double substance that you have to take a holiday
Oh,
from.
absolutely. It's just codependency. And then, a lot of people are also, I have to admit myself, sometimes I might indulge in some alcohol, socially with my cannabis. And I was hanging out with some friends, doing some happy hour, and I realized, oh, wait, I'm on this cannabis cleanse. Like, I don't have a joint to smoke, or to complement this, and that's something to really think of. But I think that excellent nutrition mixed with a good amount of exercise
Hmm.
when anybody is embarking on this tolerance break, I think is essential. Um,
Hmm.
because I think, and we're talking about people who are using this plant on a daily basis. I think people who are using it just moderately might not have to really confront these issues, but um, my appetite going down and energy levels going up, it can be tricky,
Hmm.
right? And so that was very interesting. But by the second week, um, and I actually left out in terms of sleep.
Hmm.
I had to supplement some melatonin in the mix
Mm.
because I was not getting good sleep, and
Okay.
it wasn't um as extreme as waking up in cold sweats, but it was more so my dreams just being very busy, you
Hmm.
know, and just waking up exhausted, even though I'm having maybe 6 7 hours of sleep. And I kind of knew that was expected going into it,
Yeah.
but I had never used melatonin before, prior to this. And so
Right.
I'm using just a 10 milligram dose of melatonin in the evenings, and that works great. And I
Okay.
try to some days I would forego the melatonin to see, like, am I still, is that 10 milligram from yesterday still, gonna have some effect? Sometimes it did, sometimes it didn't. But I definitely recommend those who deal with post traumatic stress or whatever sleep disturbances to consider the melatonin on a tolerance break. But for me, it was a personal journey, because when I really thought about it, we actually, this conversation started at the Emerald Conference, actually, with a group of scientists, and we were talking about what's the longest period of time someone's gone without using cannabis. And it was funny because the conversation kept revolving to, well, why would we go 30 days without using cannabis? So, and then I said, well, yeah, that's a good point. But, putting my mental health hat on, because I worked in juvenile justice, I've worked in the community like you, and I know that there is a substantial part of the population who needs to abstain for whatever reason, right? Whether that be employment, whether that be criminal justice reasons, right?
Hmm.
And so I think it's tremendous value in people understanding, okay, how do I go about this tolerance break? How do I execute it? How do I do it in a way that doesn't just completely ruin my quality of life?
Well, and plus, you want to be in charge of your life. You don't want a
Yes,
substance to be in charge of you, uh,
absolutely.
right? And so, I think this sort of, well, in the wise words of my mom, who's a pharmacist, actually, uh, everything in moderation.
Yes, yes.
And so there's another reason for it.
Yes, absolutely. And one more thing I'll mention on my because the discoveries I've come upon from this break are just fascinating. The first week of my cannabis cleanse, I was exercising, but I wasn't exercising more than I usually do, right? So I play soccer, I ride my bike. Um, but I use, prior to this cleanse, I'm using cannabis before my bike ride. If it's a 30, 40 mile bike ride, I'll maybe enjoy some in a pit stop in the middle of my ride, right?
Mhm, mhm,
Then at the end of my ride, I'm, using some cannabis. And so I didn't even understand how much it was influencing pain management.
mhm,
It was incredible. I rode my bike one morning. This I'll never forget. This is day 3. I rode my
mhm,
bike one morning because, like I said, energy levels through the roof. So I'm like, oh man, I'm feeling great. The weather just broke. Let me get on my bike. Did 10 miles, not a big deal. Felt great. And then I said, oh, you know what? I forgot I had made a reservation to play some pickup soccer tonight. So I went and played soccer. When I tell you, I was beat up for the rest of the week.
mhm.
I'm not lying. I'm talking about the next day. I was like, this is like, did I pull a muscle? Like, this isn't right. Like, what happened? And then I think on 2 days later, I just had to take an ibuprofen. And
Mm.
like, I was literally in pain. And then it dawned on me, like, wow, I'm using cannabis really all around my exercise and activities, but it's been so long that it's become part of my routine that I didn't even really realize that the pain and the inflammation that I was suppressing, right? And
Well,
so,
it has anti-inflammatory effects,
right,
that we're still trying to understand completely. It has muscle relaxing effects.
right,
So if you imagine, getting the body into the right position and to reducing any inflammation that comes from the wrong position, it's actually very interesting in regards to exercise and yeah, I think it's especially stretching. Uh,
yes,
I recommend cannabis and stretching all the time. I think it can get people realigned, but and you're still able to feel your position and feel any injuries you have. So it's not something that makes you ignore pains, but
Right.
maybe something that helps improve your relationship with pain.
Absolutely. So I have a question for your candidates that were in this study. Was this a national study where people could submit their information from anywhere in the country, or was it just really in California, local?
We asked those that were only licensed to use cannabis as medicine to respond, but that was on the respondent. They had to, and this was online, so anyone could could join. You know, anyone could respond to it. So we pretty much were getting responses from the United States in states that had medical cannabis laws in it. So people actually were pretty honest about their status in cannabis.
Absolutely, absolutely. Are there any markets or we have all these states that are coming online now with medical cannabis. Here in Georgia, there's this huge hullabaloo about cannabis oil, right?
Yes.
And we've got 22,000 patients that have
I
gone through
know.
the
Sad.
painstaking process of registering and so on and so forth. What are
And
your
they're
thoughts on?
getting it in the illegal market, right? They're going,
Right. Yeah. What are your thoughts
yeah,
on that?
what's that? Oh, it's a mess. It's a mess. You know, the rest of the country is moving forward with cannabis, and clearly there are patients interested in using it in Georgia. But you know, I think one of the mistakes that our government made in California is to see this as a cash cow. And I
Mm.
always thought, hold on, you know, we can't improve our financial uh, uh, issues on the backs of the sick, right?
Yes.
Yeah, these are
Yes.
sick people who are using. I mean,
Right.
for pharmaceuticals are not taxed, but cannabis is overtaxed, right?
Overtaxed.
And that really hurts the patient and actually drives them to purchasing their products in the illegal market.
Right.
And that really is a step backwards in terms of making sure that there are no pesticides or toxins in the product, that there are no adulterants, you know, other ingredients. These are all important things for people who are using this as medicine. So it's the government trying to make money basically off of this. That's kind of, and it's the patients who again are suffering from this. It's not a good situation in states like Georgia, and hopefully they move faster than they have. It's been very slow, dragging their feet as they all try to jockey for positions on who's going to make the money off of this plant. And really, it should be about the people and
Absolutely.
improving their health.
Absolutely. And when you mention contaminants and pesticides and really California has a system of lab testing cannabis that's in the medical market. Do you think at some point in the future or way down the line we're going to see some kind of uniform standards across the board from state to state in terms of what's expected in terms of how we're testing and what we're testing for?
Yeah, that's a hot topic at Emerald Conference.
Yeah.
There are a few organizations that are working on standards and testing. Um, it's slow because there are so many potentially active ingredients in the plants already. It's a botanical, and so the plant can also picks up things from the soil pretty easily.
Right.
So part of the work is discovering all the potential issues with the plant. Um, and that's what slows down we're in a phase of discovery at this point. We really can't
Right.
say these are the final rules. I mean, California first looked at cannabinoids, right, and said,
Right.
well, you have to put the level of cannabinoid that's in the product. Well, that's great, but we know that there are other classes of chemicals that are affecting the plant, like the terpenes, right? So
Sure.
we haven't regulated that and said, well, you should also put the terpenes, or how do you describe the terpenes? Because there are different groups of terpenes affecting the plant or causing an effect on the person. So we're in discovery phase right now, but eventually we'll figure it all out and get some standardized testing for it.
Absolutely. I think I'd love to schedule another interview for you with you where we can really dive into terpene profiles and how those interact with the cannabinoids and what we know about that. Because I know that that's a new emerging science
Yeah,
that the scientists are still unpacking, and that
yeah,
the average citizen, I think are just starting to even hear the word terpene, right?
yeah.
And kind of find out that terpenes, like you said, have an effect on us, by themselves. And so,
Well, just a quick comment on that. There is an alternative, branch of medical treatment called aromatherapy
right.
uh, that people have been using for a while. And, it's sort of is linked also to the perfume industry.
Yeah.
Uh, and terpenes are really aromatics. They cause different aromas. And so that's really interesting to me to see that coming full circle, aromatherapy in cannabis now.
Oh, absolutely. I blew my mother-in-law's mind one day because I had some cannabis, and my mother-in-law, my wife, they find particular strains to be a nuisance. The Gorilla Glue, the Marathon OG. I'm not appreciated if I even open the jar in the house. But I had to explain to her. I said, Nana, you know, you do realize that the lavender plant has terpenes just like the cannabis plant, right? And lavender is very soothing and it's very
Mhm,
relaxing. And I
mhm,
explained to her that you know the the effect I get from the terpenes from the cannabis plant really calm me down and
mhm.
soothe my nerves, and it just happens to be a nuisance to you, right? Just the way somebody might love their coffee beans, and other people might be disgusted by the smell of coffee, right? And so it's very subjective. But I want to I don't want to take up too much more of your time, but I do want to ask you one more question. I'm a graduate of Morehouse College,
Mhm,
and one thing that really got me fired up at the Emerald Conference is exposing our young people to this vast array of opportunities in the cannabis space in terms of cannabis science careers, right?
mhm,
Um,
mhm,
and unfortunately, particularly in the HBCU community, we're not really talking about cannabis science careers. I think a lot of even just administration period, they're not talking about it at all. But
mhm,
amongst the student body population, I feel like our young men and women are still focused on cultivation and dispensary ownership. And true enough, there is no industry without cultivation, right?
mhm,
But when we talk about all the ancillary opportunities in business and cannabis, but particularly in science and medicine,
mhm,
what's some advice you would give a young person who's in undergraduate study, whether it's
mhm.
an HBCU or not, but that's interested in cannabis science? Where do they go to learn about opportunities and get some direction in terms of how to find their way in the medical cannabis or even recreational cannabis science, universe?
Wow. Well, I'd say the opportunities you need to make them yourself. They're not there right now. The industry jumped to cultivation and selling the product, and science is kind of lagging behind, and the
Mm,
institutions are not really um, promoting studies on endocannabinoids or cannabinoids, but you can blaze this trail on your own.
yeah,
I learn the fundamentals, biochemistry, botany, learn
mhm,
about plants, how they produce their chemicals, and then you will be a pioneer in this field. I think we're going there. It's not that it'll never be there. It's that
yeah,
we need the younger minds to start looking at the traditional paradigms and creating some paradigm shifts so that
absolutely.
we can move this field forward and help more people as far as I see.
Absolutely. We're actually working on, speaking of pioneers, we're actually working on a cannabis education and career panel at Morehouse College. We're doing our surveys and our due diligence and getting it together now, but we're going to be moving forward with that in the fall because graduation is just weeks away. So,
Right.
but I'd love to invite you back to,
I'd love
join the
to.
panel and really talk about this, right? And like you mentioned, we need to blaze our own trail, and we can't wait for somebody to open the door for us or hand us that opportunity. We know that cannabis laboratories are going to grow and just proliferate all over the country, especially state to state. Um, and when we talk about the science of this plant and the evolution of this plant, there's so many opportunities. And these young people, I know that there's so much innovation that is yet to really be cultivated in our young students. So I'm super passionate about that, and I'd love to get you involved with that as well.
I'm happy to contribute. Absolutely. Yeah, it's going to be one of those young minds that are really going to make the discoveries that brings us all forward.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Well, Dr. Talleyrand, I just want to thank you for your time and your insight. Just so informative. I'm looking forward to our terpene profile conversation. Right. Um, I
You are
really,
a true cannabis nerd. I like it.
oh yeah. Oh, for sure, for sure. That to me is just fascinating to me because you know I didn't need a scientist to tell me that the terpenes are doing something, but but
Experienced it yourself.
I've
Yeah.
experienced it myself. But like we all know, we need the data to support it, right?
Yes.
And so, super excited about that. But thank you for joining us, and I can't wait to have you on next time.
Look forward to it. Thank
Thank you.
you.